Good afternoon, Matt.
Good afternoon, Mark Schmitt. How are you doing?
Very good, very good.
Let's tell the kind folks who we are. I am Matt Welch, editor-in-chief of Reason magazine of free minds and free markets, where this month you can read about George W. Bush's disaster socialism. Mark Schmitt is executive editor, is that the correct
Executive editor, yeah, I don't know.
Of American Prospect, where right now we can read...
We can read our cover story on, I wish I had it right here, to hold up. It's called New Deal 2, This Time It's Global. And it's kind of a movie poster kind of theme with some really good pieces about future of the economy. We've got some good pieces about politics as well.
So you want to take the New Deal global. What do you see right now as the kind of the possibilities for lack of a better word, or maybe you like the word, the progressive agenda, or the agenda that the American Prospect is interested in? What do you see in terms of a fertile ground with the incoming Obama administration?
Well, I think it's the kind of arguments that we've been making are one, that to really address the problems in the economy, unlike the New Deal, and there's a lot of reminiscence about the New Deal, and we've certainly trafficked in a lot of that, mostly favorable, as have you, mostly unfavorable. But the big difference between then and now is that a solution that's primarily focused on the domestic economy won't really work. And in an article in our magazine this month, Harold Meyerson kind of draws out the many different ways in which we need some kind of global regulatory, at least set of agreements or understandings about what we're dealing with in order to tackle problems. So that, for example, the office that drove AIG into the ground, AIG, the insurance company that was bailed out a couple months ago, it was trades being made in an office by London that were actually regulated by a U.S. banking regulator that was not at all prepared to handle the kind of complexity that they were dealing with. But all these things are you have regulators in one country, people in another, transactions in another, and the same is true with things like product safety and the way those things are regulated. So that it's not a very detailed blueprint for exactly how you're going to do this, but really to confront the idea that there's a lot more to it than just re-regulation on the U.S. end. And then the other aspect of it is thinking about, do we have the wherewithal to take on the challenge of the coming depression, and then what follows from that?
So you're convinced we're in a coming depression. Let's take that R right off and start dusting off the D.
Well, I think there's probably I mean Bob Kuttner, who's I'm kind of reflecting his piece here, would argue that there is a depression unless we do enough to stop it, and that doing enough to stop it is not simply monetary policy like what the Fed did yesterday. That it's a bigger task than that requires being willing really to take the brakes off fiscal policy and potentially talk about more than a $500 billion stimulus, but talk about potentially a stimulus over 2 years that could be as high as $1.4 trillion.
Well, haven't we already gotten to a level where we're talking about $8.4 trillion or 8.5 that I think Bloomberg and other reputable organizations have been kicking around, of which, give or take, $3.5 billion is already sort of committed in a variety of bailouts, and then there's another maybe $4 billion in guarantees. I mean, we're talking about half of GDP at this point, even before Obama is sworn in, that has been pegged to something having to do with this bailout. And
right, but
history
the bailout
has not been very kind to countries who sort of overnight create debt that is half the size of their GDP.
Well, the bailouts and stimulus are two different elements. One is where you're trying to sustain a financial institution from collapse, and government was going to wind up with assets of some value, at the moment unknown. And stimulus is where you're really actually trying to create jobs, fill in needed investments, do all the things that get the economy, that basically bring up aggregate demand. Bailouts don't bring up aggregate demand for the most part. unless bailing out the auto companies sustains a level of employment that then feeds into demand. So I would just separate those two things, and I don't think that I don't think that I don't think that we should count bailouts against all other spending, because we really have no idea what the value of those bailouts is ultimately going to be.
Right, but we do know that if you are going to be engaged in trillion-dollar budget deficits, and I think there's been talk that we'll reach that level this year, and at this point I think Obama is projecting something along those lines next year.
Right.
Got to pay for that somewhere, and that has to come through issuance of more debt or the printing of more money, and we're seeing a ton of both. And I don't think that there's been many cases in history where that doesn't end up coming around and what's the word? Reflecting itself in the economy and things like greater inflation. I mean, we're talking about this deflationary moment where asset prices are taking a hammering and causing the sort of collective pants-sweating moment of our political elite, I think, in the Republican Party, Democratic Party alike, and a lot of media at the same time, while these asset prices are going down, they will reach bottom, and when that comes, we're going to notice that, oops, suddenly we've increased the debt load by 50% in 6 weeks, and that will reflect in inflation. We have, I think, and there's a great new book out by Robert Samuelson called The Great Inflation that we excerpted out of our January issue. I think that we as a country have forgotten about inflation because we haven't really had any.
Yeah. Well, we've got the
and
tools.
What we're doing right now, I'm worried, and is that we are in an attempt to try to sort of stem this asset price deflation, which is the correction of a bubble, in an attempt to sort of make that landing softer and more palatable to people who don't like rapid change. We are going to build in the next great inflation.
Well, it's possible one might. The story of the great inflation that Samuelson writes about, which is an interesting bit of history and involved some financial mismanagement, but it involved some certain amount of fiscal stupidness. But the problem wasn't that we ran a huge deficit or ran a huge debt. That's not what caused the inflation of the 70s. I don't know why you'd want to obsess about a problem that we don't have when there are so many problems that we do have.
Well, it's because every government action has a reaction, and short-term itis in public policy is not our friend. And this is a good enough segue into a piece that you just wrote. I don't know if it was online or in the magazine. I think in the magazine, because I couldn't read the whole thing. I had to pay for a subscription that I don't have. Whoa,
wait a minute. I write my check to Reason magazine. I would comp you, but I actually pay for Reason, so I want you to...
Look, we're in the process of managing our subscriptions here in the office, and things go slow. Talk a little bit about that. You're talking about sort of the idea that in a crisis, a government has to experiment and become innovative, and you see that as a good thing, whereas I might wince a little bit. Talk about that.
Well, I think the column is not quite as what's the difference? Not quite as normative as that. I argue, if you try to read, if you read American economic history and you read the history of the relationship between government and the economy, it's most conventionally told as a tale of, with each crisis, wars, economic crises, and so forth. Government takes a jump in size. And it also takes, what I argued, it also always takes a slightly different form, so that with each jump in size, it's not just spending gets bigger or the number of regulations gets bigger. It's government finds a different way to participate in the economy. The role of stimulating the economy was a new one, not even in the first stage of the New Deal, but really in the second one. The role of government as a kind of guarantor of loans, which is a backdrop of some of the fiscal crisis, guarantee of home loans, guarantee of student loans, huge role that it plays in the economy that developed in the 60s and 70s. So each piece brings a different form, and I wanted to just draw out that I think there are two forms of government role in the economy that we're moving into and that are kind of interesting. whether we're for them or not, it doesn't sort of matter. They're there in different ways. And I think the first role is kind of the patient investor. That's the role you play in the bailout, because you know there's something of value there, and you know that for some reason the market has failed. No one wants to buy these things for any price possible because they don't have the patience or the ability to wait and find out what the real value is in that asset, in those assets.
Name something that for an example here.
Well, I mean, I think all the financial bailouts are like that. There's a great example from the auto bailout hearings where, and it's Senator Bennett, Bob Bennett from Utah, and he's kind of pushing Rick Wagner, the head of GM, about why they don't. He's kind of encouraging them to merge with Chrysler, or at least form some kind of technology partnerships with Chrysler. And Wagner says, we could do that, but the market isn't interested in financing that. We can't get financing to do that. And Bennett says, look, you're talking to the government now. The government is the most patient investor of all. We can wait for this. So what you're saying, you're not saying it's a bad business idea. You're saying these short-term focused investors aren't interested in it. We're saying we, the government, are patient investors. We can wait to see whether that plays out, even though it's not going to derive a profit in the next quarter, the quarter after that. We can wait. And it was a very explicit statement that here's, if the government's going to play a role like in the auto bailout, the role it plays is being something like a Warren Buffett that can wait and that can wait for the value when nobody else has the patience to wait for it, and nobody even in the boom years.
In fairness of Warren Buffett, who is probably the most over-invoked human being on this planet, if I hear him nominated for another government job, in theory by anyone,
I'm not nominating him. I'm just saying. I'm just identifying what his modus operandi is as an investor.
Warren Buffett makes money. You're not going to bail out Chrysler or, frankly, invest in it if you want to make money. You're doing it to prevent bankruptcy because you have decreed, as George Bush did, I think, last night on CNN, that bankruptcy is just too messy. We can't have all that mess in our economy. It's not a money-making thing. Warren Buffett would never in his dreams invest in Chrysler because Chrysler is a crappy business. So, I mean, yes, the government could sit around and be a patient investor. It's the zillion-pound gorilla. But then where do you draw the line? Who deserves that investment in order to stave off? How do they qualify? I don't see how you escape the idea that they qualify if they're about to fail. And that's not a recipe for investment that's going to pay off dividends in any way, shape, or form.
I mean, I think that's fair enough. You're not making the choices for the same reason. I mean, you could say, look, I think, 15 years down the line, some version of Chrysler merged with GM with certain costs stripped out or whatever is going to be a very viable business.
You know what? I don't agree with you, but I mean, I understand that. I understand that line of thinking. It's one that I have thought myself. For instance, about newspapers, which I've written about and participated in over the years. I, like a lot of people, maybe you, thought, hey, look, these things are printing money. Compared to Walmart, they make 3-4 times the profit margins historically, 20%, 25%, even 30% as recently as 3 or 4 years ago. And they were taking a battering on stock markets. And so people, good journalism, practitioners and keepers of the flame said the problem is the stock market. The problem is not the newspapers. And so, what we need is a rich sugar daddy to come in and take it off the stock market. Well, I have seen Sam Zell,
right,
and he believed, like you, theorize at least about Chrysler, that hey, look, these things are making money. It's a good investment. I'm going to sit and wait until sentiment, comes to its senses in the market, and I'm going to make a killing. Well, that hasn't worked out that well. And to put the government in
Sam
position...
Sam Zell did not behave patiently.
Well, he can't behave patiently because he doesn't have, several $1 trillion. He floated a bunch of
he's
debt
not
and got
actually a
involved in
sugar.
the debt.
He's not actually a sugar daddy.
Well,
he didn't put his money in. He borrowed money.
Yes, I mean it's a whole different kettle of fish or whatever the mixed metaphor is. But he did bet on newspapers and believed in them in a way that by definition very few other people did at the time because no one else is buying the Tribune Company or many other newspapers for that matter. So, I mean, the overall point is that if you put the government in the position of being 1,000 Sam Zells, yet with a bigger pocketbook, I don't think that that necessarily is going to lead you to a good place. I think that actually threatens to bring you to a terrible place, which is that, yes, the government can be the patient investor all it wants, and then it can wake up in the morning and it owns huge chunks of American industry and paying and justifying it by keeping a hold of X number of jobs. And that's just not going to be an efficient use of dollars. It's going to crowd out innovative dollars out there, and it's going to be a sort of a spiral for bad management of the economy.
Okay, but we're there.
Yeah.
So now what do we do? I mean, now government is an actor in the economy in the way that it wasn't the last time you and I did a Blogging Heads,
Look, I mean, I remember hearing a lot of people saying, after 9/11, hey, look, privacy is over, get over it, Look, we're in this new reality. And back then, we took a very unpopular view, which is that, hey, look, you can't just rush through a Patriot Act because everyone has peed their pants. You can't just suddenly give up on the principles that this country has been very successful with over the years, which in terms of things like 9/11 and the defense industry have to do with sort of an openness, a belief in the fact that we don't have to militarize absolutely every part of American life and that is part of our strength. And I think there's a great analogy in the economy right now. The instinct in any moment of crisis, and it's an understandable one, is to let's go to the person who's got the biggest hammer or the biggest pocketbook. Right. It's not always a good instinct. I mean, you brought up Fannie Mae and the guarantee of mortgages. I'm not sure that really turned out well. I mean, it's a classic case of, hey, look, everybody wants home ownership to rise and for Americans to be able to afford homes. It's a great, great thing. We all agree. A stupid sub-example that I dwell on because I'm from Southern California is, I forget the name of the act, but I think it's called the Fair Insurance Act. Came out because of the 68 riots, basically, Martin Luther King riots and elsewhere, all throughout the country that just really tore this country apart. And so the idea was, we need to be able to guarantee home loans and other kind of lending in inner cities where the private market has failed. Great, totally understandable. We understand that. And now who's taking advantage of those fair kind of insurances? It's the city of Malibu. It's people who build in places that insurers, for very, very, very good reason, don't want to insure. And so, I mean, you have these incredible unintended consequences of these kind of bold, innovative experimentation, and those things themselves lead to bubbles and the bursting of those bubbles. And so my approach is to say, first, let's do no harm. Let's not take the principle of throw anything to the wall and see if it sticks, because when it's the government, you throw something to the wall, whether it sticks or not, it's going to be with you in most cases for generations to come.
Well, I mean, I think the story of the government's role in providing insurance for loans and enabling people to become homeowners goes back to the Federal Home Mortgage, I guess FHMA, which is late 40s, 1950s, and that's the whole making of the American middle class has to do with that. Now, I think it's very clear that in the late 90s and into this period, we kind of became so obsessed with home ownership as, we went too far with that. But that doesn't mean that the previous 4 decades were a big mistake. I mean, it created the kind of country we live in. Now you've gone to the point where, A, you have stupid unintended consequences with that, and you've also done something that's left people a lot more vulnerable than they would have been before, because of the obsession with creating the ownership society, and ownership is a kind of vulnerability. But I don't think that this is the classic. The classic argument of reaction is everything has unintended consequences, therefore don't do them. I mean, be aware of consequences and manage them. I don't think that. We're going to do, unless you want to do nothing in relation to either the financial situation or the auto bailout, you have to be willing to wade into situations that might have unintended consequences.
What's wrong with letting bankruptcy take its course of the automakers? What's wrong with a process that people negotiate with their creditors, people come in, they buy off chunks that are productive, they ignore chunks that are unproductive? Why can't, or maybe a better question is, what for you is small enough that we can allow it to fail, if not the automakers.
I mean, I don't. All I know is what I read in the paper about the consequences of bankruptcy for the whole chain of suppliers to the auto industry, and then the whole chain of companies that are tied to those same suppliers. I mean, the consequences would be enormous for companies that you can't look at them and say, "Oh, you screwed up your business." I mean, the economy is deeply intertwined. So one way or another, either you would do a very tightly managed kind of bankruptcy, which would in many ways look like a bailout in and of itself, or you do something where you're intervening more directly.
Bankruptcy is not liquidation. It's and I see this bandied about on a daily basis, and it's bizarre. I mean, plenty of companies go through bankruptcies, and some of them come out the other end smelling like a rose. Certainly the auto companies will not. But the point is that there is an auto industry in this country outside of the big three, and it's doing pretty well. And there's manufacturing in this country outside of auto manufacturing, and it also has been until very recently doing very well itself. So the bankruptcy process is a process by which you can find value for bits of the company that have value.
Right, but creditors are on hold. Creditors are on hold during a reorganization.
Sure.
And we've got a lot of creditors who can't be on hold. I mean, these are not entirely private entities. I mean, we structured the market that created the auto companies. We structured the market that created the non-big three auto companies. Every one of those, every one of Senator Corker's and Senator Shelby's companies got huge public subsidies to locate those factories in those states. I mean, government is intertwined with these things from the beginning. And so to sort of say, oh, now let the private sector take its course, is kind of silly.
Yeah, but then that chain of logic is the same one that you hear, when people advocate for mandatory drug testing of baseball players or something like that. It's, well, we've given them an antitrust exemption, so therefore we can do anything we want with this group of people. And it's, government taxes everybody, so we all interface with the government on some level. That should not in and of itself be an excuse to justify any government action, let alone the sloshing around of any numbers of billions of dollars of my money, I might add. I mean, this, not that I have much, but it is on some fundamental level of fairness pretty infuriating to me that companies that are productive are going to be taxed to prop up companies that are not productive or who took big risks and should be punished because of those risks. And there I'm talking about the financial industry much more. And the same is true of homeowners. People who flipped their mortgages in 2006 and who therefore now are probably going to qualify for some kind of relief from the federal government using my money. I didn't buy a house. I acted with some amount of prudence, I would hope, and yet it's my money and it's going to people who took risks. I think that creates all kinds of troubles, and just a fundamental one is that it ain't fair.
Well, I mean, I hear you on a lot of those points. I mean, I don't, it's not like I don't like to make, ridiculous stretch arguments like, well, an antitrust exemption gives government the right to do anything. It is not a purely private problem, however, if the big three suddenly went up in a cloud of smoke. That is not a purely private problem, and they paid their taxes too. The workers paid their taxes. The executives paid their taxes. The legacy costs are in a sense a public cost. I mean, that would obviously be the highest priority for me, would be to figure out an approach to health care that absorbs some of those legacy costs. Now, I know you said those are products of private contracts and so forth, but it's a societal problem. At a certain point, something is of a scale that's a societal problem.
But I don't mean to sort of like bust your balls on this, but what is that point? It's something that I'm genuinely fascinated with. With financial institutions, I do understand the argument. I disagree with it, but I understand it of, well, when X is of a certain size, and let's just call that, I don't even know, market capitalization or number of trades or whatever, plus it has a level of complexity and interweavedness with the rest of the financial sector. Therefore, we can't let another one of these large investment banks fail. Okay, I get the argument. I don't agree, like I said. But even then, I ask, what's the level? I mean, at what number of jobs is it that you look at, or is it the amount of dollars? Do you have a number? Do you think that way?
I don't, and I don't even know. I'm sort of, I watch those auto hearings, and I don't have a. I'm sort of, it's one of those moments where I'm glad I'm not a senator. Obviously, I mean, you would spend a lot of money to prevent the state of Michigan from being, swept away by floods if you could, right? So you would sort of at what point
I'm not convinced, but go on.
You're not. I know you would. We're all. You're on your own if it's absolute. If you're willing to be absolute about it.
No, I mean I'm not actually absolute about it. I look at it. I look at it again in terms of fairness and in terms of what is the most efficient way to spend anyone's dollars, let alone my own tax dollars. And I'm just not convinced. I mean, it is possible that mine eyes are scarred by living in Eastern Europe, where I saw a lot of government intervention, and that just didn't turn out so well for people. And you would hear a lot of the exact same arguments, basically, like X, steel factory in southern Bohemia is just too darn big to fail. We got to prop it up forever. And eventually, that thing is going to go bankrupt because you just can't keep throwing money into a black hole. It just doesn't work out for you. And what fills me with some dread is that ultimately, after all the perambulations and discussions about this stuff, places in Eastern Europe, places that I never would have necessarily banked on, like in Slovakia, you saw people coming out with a decision that, okay, even though, yes, this is a mixed market and yada yada, basically the direction should be in the direction of allowing private capitalism to work, including stuff going bankrupt and stuff being built. And it seems to me that in this country right now, we've lost our nerve about that. We're going in a different direction. And I've never seen any sort of evidence, although I'm sure there's chunks of them there, that you're going to get a better bang for your buck if the government is spending it. By definition, that becomes a political case, and you got the absurd spectacle of senators managing industrial policy. How could that not go well?
Well, why did we lose our nerve? We didn't lose our nerve. I mean, the funny thing about it is we didn't lose our nerve because Obama got elected and a bunch of liberals are in power and people like, Ted Kennedy and Barney Frank said, aha, it's our chance to finally shove through that industrial policy we've been talking about for 30 years. We lost our nerve because the libertarian experiment collapsed in certain fundamental ways.
Name one libertarian experiment that collapsed.
An entirely deregulated financial system.
The regulation under Bush increased more than any president since Richard Nixon and probably since Lyndon Johnson. Regulation of the financial sector increased both in terms...
what's your measure of that?
We have an economist, columnist, Veronique Derougy, who measures regulations that have, I believe the standard of measured is an effect of $100 million or more of the economy adjusted for inflation and these kind of things. And in her look, and both in terms of government spending, but specifically of regulation, and in regulation in the financial sector, George Bush has increased it. I mean, it's really easy. It's a fun thing to say. It's this, terrible dog-eat-dog capitalism and deregulation that did everything. Well, Glass-Steagall, not Glass-Steagall, I should say. We could talk about that separately. But Sarbanes-Oxley happened in 2003. Last time I looked, that was a pretty serious regulation of the financial sector. I mean, I do think that there were mistakes made in terms of regulations. I think that the SEC and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission and the whole regulatory structure made a terrible error by not creating or mandating a clearinghouse for over-the-counter securities like credit default swaps. You got to be able to count whatever is out there in gigantor numbers and to say what are their value, where do they lie. I mean, a lot of the problem right now is people are just spooked because they don't know where the toxins are. That was a regulatory problem. I'm here to cop to it. But I'm not here just to sort of sit and take, the libertarians ran roughshod over everything and they got what was coming to them.
I mean, it's small L. Okay, we'll have to do a link to the measure of regulation. I will say, I thought you're the writer you just mentioned, Veronique Derougy, and I'm glad you know how to pronounce her name, had a very nice piece in your last issue, which really went to a very interesting question, which is a challenge to liberals, which is to say it's very hard to put your finger on, the thing that caused this whole mess. and I got challenged on this in a talk I gave a few weeks ago, and it was an interesting reminder, and her article was helpful to me. However, because Glass-Steagall was a very small part of it, and you could not keep the wall. The Glass-Steagall wall was a silly barrier that wasn't doing anybody any favors. You had to do something about Glass-Steagall, where you had all these non-bank banks emerging, including those tied to the auto companies. There was.
So that was a deregulation that you agreed with.
Well, it was a deregulation that had to happen. It could have happened in other ways. I thought her article did a very good job of saying there's no one thing you can point to as the key deregulation. I mean, it's not necessarily the Commodities Futures Modernization Act. But I thought in each place she did cop to, well, this deregulation wasn't. It was more errors of omission than errors of commission, and absence of replacing things in the right way. I thought it was actually quite a balanced article that still left me feel like.
That was Catherine Mangu Ward who wrote that.
Oh, you're right. I'm
piece.
sorry.
All
your people have such complicated names, except for you.
We're here to confound people.
I'm sorry about that. Well, that was a terrific piece. We'll link to that one also. I thought it was a very good piece. I thought on the whole it left me feeling like, well, overall there were in each aspect there were either failures to regulate things that we saw emerging that should have been regulated, such as you've just acknowledged, or deregulations that occurred in sloppy and kind of corrupted ways. That the aggregate effect was to create a pretty radically deregulated financial system, and the fact that this guy could operate a $50 billion Ponzi scheme while getting clean bills of health is a pretty strong indication that we didn't have the kind of Securities and Exchange Commission that could follow up on signs of problems and track them down.
There's no doubt that the ratings agencies, which are supposedly now, at least under the auspices of the SEC, could use a hell of a lot more transparency. But I would also, again, to point out, when you talk about sort of libertarianism and stuff, it was the libertarian on the SEC, Paul Atkins, who was advocating very specifically for the mandating of a clearinghouse to track credit default swaps, while the SEC chair was going off on half-baked schemes to register hedge funds as investment advisors and Lord knows what else that was pretty irrelevant to what was going on. It was Our Magazine who was saying in 2004, if you have Fannie and Freddie out there trading in all of these unmeasured credit default swaps and sort of hedge fund-like derivatives and activities like that, we need to actually track that and limit that in a way that we limit it to the private sector. And so I think that we often get a strangely weird rap because I think it's because people, it's easier to tell a vague story than it is to tell a specific story.
Well, I think
George
the distinction
Bush has been no libertarian's friend. I mean, there's a reason why he's on our cover with a mean headline right now, and there's a reason why this magazine and Cato Institute and people who believe in limited government have been sort of virulently opposed to the guy since very soon after he took office, if not before.
Right. Well, maybe if I can modify and extend, it was an experiment in libertarian idea. Something like Phil Graham kind of represents this well. Libertarian ideology masking pure crony capitalism. How's that?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds wonderful, and like, what's the example? It's like, what is the libertarian thing that Phil Graham said he was doing, and what was the crony capitalism thing that he was actually doing?
Well, I mean,
maybe there's an answer to that question.
Right,
I'm always interested in specifics.
I mean, the rhetoric was always, we need to keep our hands off, we can't regulate these markets, but in fact you were creating regulatory structures that did advantage certain players and not others in the Commodities Futures Modernization Act and elsewhere. And that had some consequences.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, as I mentioned before, I think that they made a mistake of not measuring and not keeping a transparency on some of these sectors. But I would hope that you would also acknowledge that such is the nature of regulation, whether it's domestic regulation or Harold Meyerson's one world government regulation or whatever. You're going to have people with money trying to game the system to their advantage. That is what happens with regulation. There is no counterexample of that in history, as far as I know, except when the government controls all the means of production, but even then it gets its own sort of political skewing. That's what happens. We shouldn't be surprised at that. We should act to fight with it and create a level playing field. But that's really what libertarians who are actual libertarians fight for. Give us a clear set of rules. And this might segue into something else. I mean, your article sort of about innovation of government and like trying to figure out a different way of approaching things on different during different crises. I think it's a pretty interesting thing to chew on. The Reason Foundation, which publishes our August magazine, engages in public policy work, and what they do is basically that. I mean, they have an annual publication called Innovators in Action, where they take mostly governors and sometimes mayors who are doing interesting ways to get more bang for their buck on policy having to do with transportation and any number of other kind of like government streamlining things. They're interested in good government, believe it or not. Reason Foundation,
right.
That's kind of what they do. But I'm losing my train of thought. Damn you, Internet. We were talking about your great article.
Innovations.
Innovation. Oh, sing me a Christmas song. Damn it, this was a very good
There's no singing. No singing here.
No singing? I got a kazoo. I can...
You can sing. You can sing all you want.
Yeah. Anyways, yes. So bold, the persistent experimentation on the New Deal of everyone's dreams and nightmares. I am no New Deal historian, and I am, unlike most other opinion commentators, not going to pretend to be one. I am persuaded...
You can outsource it to Amity Schlaze.
I can outsource it to her. I can outsource it to any number of people. And I understand that she's undergone... all kinds of scrutiny up and down. But her thesis, or not just hers, but sort of a broad or more than one person sort of a band of thought out there that makes intuitive sense, and I'm curious to hear you correct me where it is wrong. When the government, who is the biggest player in the room, is constantly changing its mind about what the rules are, a new bold experiment every day that sort of cancels out the previous one from the day before. It would stand, and this is what Henry Paulson has been doing, ever since he started opening his mouth. It stands to reason that people, given that environment, people with money, people who would be interested in investing, creating jobs, or doing whatever, might sit on their hands a little bit. When you don't have one sort of set of rules and a sort of a policing or a referee of the market or of the rules or whatever, but those rules change constantly, and we've seen this so much during the bailout. Then people want to sit on their hands and wait to see how it all shakes out. When is the government going to decide what its real approach is? And until then, you have a lot of people who would otherwise be productively investing or engaging somehow in the economy, not doing anything.
Well, I certainly agree with that, and I don't necessarily use that FDR quote. A lot of people do. It does suggest, and there was a certain frenzy, certainly in the early New Deal, and plenty of things that, as I tried to point out, there's always this fascination with the 100 days, and I've tried to point out in my article about Obama in the previous issue of the magazine. Most of the things that FDR did in the first 100 days were actually, some of them were emergency measures and some of them were unconstitutional. So it's not like the groundwork for the New Deal era was actually laid in 100 days, and that kind of frenzied experimentation, I don't think is appropriate. There is a place for a kind of pragmatism in the sense that, when you look at the situation, you're not kind of bound by a particular ideology for what you can do or can't do, that you're willing to sort of take on the reality of the situation, which is one very different from what, either of our ideological approaches would sort of predict. It's a crisis because it's a whole new set of situations in the economy, and to try to look at those on their own terms and figure out the appropriate solutions. And that does not mean obviously certainty is an incredibly important variable in creating a culture in which people are willing to invest. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I guess I want to say just to finish up. where I think you were going on in my column last week, because I talked about how I think another element of I think that I'm not as I'm pretty accepting of the fact that the other side of the coin of government being more obviously playing this role in the economy is that government has to accept innovations that involve using market forces more. So to me, I think one of the most interesting things that's happened in the last couple of years is a move away, from people who wanted to do pure single-payer health care to saying, we're going to kind of structure a market, we're going to have participants in it, and then, the government's actually going to be a model within that economy. We are going to have a public health plan, which the private ones have to compete with. That's a kind of, embrace of market solutions, which I think is a really important innovation, and I think, I think obviously, your colleagues at the Reason Foundation come at it from a different point of view than maybe mine do, but in some ways we're converging on something where I think there's potentially a greater acceptance of a public-private market role that's done with full awareness of the unintended consequences.
Now that you brought up a single payer, which is a big sort of great fundraising tactic on the right in terms of a scare story about what the evil lefties are going to come and do to us next. Why don't you go through any other ones like that? I know George Will, who, for my money, has been writing pretty excellently in the last year or so. He's in his criticism of John McCain, among other people, he's been pretty acute. I think he missed the mark pretty badly in a recent column, saying that liberals are rubbing their hands together because they're going to reinstall the fairness doctrine.
Yes.
That's
another fundraising. That's a great the fairness doctrine thing is the great right-wing fundraising technique.
No, we had a piece by Jesse Walker in a couple issues back, who's written quite a lot about the FCC, in which he makes a pretty persuasive case that the fairness doctrine is just not on the table in any meaningful way.
It's not on the table.
I mean, I'm sure there are idiot Democratic congressmen that could more than fill the room that I'm sitting in who would love to see it, but it's just not going anywhere, and it's not part of the general wish list. Right. However, that said, there are the kind of regulations that people like us don't necessarily like, because we do take the whole Congress shall pass no law phrase pretty seriously.
And stop right there, period.
Yeah. Well, no, when it comes to the freedom of speech and whatnot, are things that again come from this idea of, hey, look, we're doing, we're being pragmatic about trying to use government for good, and we're making sure that that there is X percentage of minority-owned businesses in broadcasting and all this kind of stuff, and that's just itself a minority in the whole thing. But there's just sort of an existing kind of superstructures of regulations that never really go away, and they make every single merger a torturous session and an opportunity for lobbying and all this other kind of stuff. And that is where, pernicious things are going to happen in the FCC. But my question to you is, disabuse the fundraisers of the right of any other, scare stories that you think are not likely to happen. We got single payer, we got fairness doctrine. Are there some other things that aren't going to happen? Please tell me one of them is a card check.
Well, what are people most afraid of? I mean, fairness
card
doctrine
check.
isn't going to. Oh, card check. Well, card check. It's really interesting to kind of speculate about where the politics of that are right now. Obviously, millions and gazillions of dollars have been spent by the Chamber of Commerce and others on it would take away the secret ballot language. I think there's. Obama's in an interesting position because he's obviously a strong supporter of labor. Just to back up and explain, this is the legislation known as the Employee Free Choice Act that would allow people to organize a union by a majority of workers in a work site checking off on a card that they want to be part of a union. Right now, that process then leads to an election, which is often delayed. There's a lot of intimidation that goes on and so forth. That's how I would describe the legislation. As soon as a majority says they want to be part of it, they can organize a union and then try to get to the first contract and so forth. Right now, we have almost no union organizing in this country that takes place on those normal terms. You have organizing that takes place with, when the governor is forcing, liberal governors force agreements that lead to organization of home health care workers and things like that, or you have these big corporate campaigns that involve consumer pressure. But very little of the classic union organizing goes on. I think we haven't revisited those labor law reform died in 1978. Famous filibuster, probably one of the great founding moments of the conservative movement. I think it would be a great thing to pass, and I think it would lead to some more kind of normal formation of unions in places where workers want unions.
What do you think about the likelihood, though?
I think the likelihood is that there will be a push to do it quickly, and I think there'll be probably some kind of compromise. I mean, I think moving towards something like expedited elections after the cards are checked. Right now I think it's 30% leads you to an election, but that often can take place many years later. Something like expedited elections might be the kind of compromise that you get there. I mean, really, it's one of those really subtle questions that hinges on, a couple of Republican senators who have been, I think they had 52 votes for cloture previously. With the new Democratic senators, they're probably at 58 or 59. They had Specter before, no other Republicans. So it's the likelihood hinges on such a handful of Republican and moderate Democratic senators. I think frankly for the right, I think it's a silly thing to hang your whole destiny on. I think it will. I do not. I think it will be. It's not going to card check by itself is not going to lead to a level of union density in the American workforce comparable to what we saw in the 50s or 60s, prosperous decades, by the way. And that it would be great if it did, and it's probably not going to lead to that anyway. But that one's not going away for good reason. For good reason, it's a good. I'm not for the fairness doctrine. I'm not actually for single payer health care, but EFCA is pretty important.
From where I sit, the objection to card check isn't necessarily a zero-sum union thing. It's changing rules so that a secret ballot is no longer secret and is open to any kind of sort of open intimidation in the process, and that's what people are, I think, rightly concerned with. And I don't. Just recall when I was sitting on the ed board of the LA Times, and we received visitors who were in favor of this, and were explaining exactly the politics by which 50 years ago or something like that. And again, you correct me where I'm wrong. Labor's position was, no, we need these anonymous balloting and such, and that's the most important thing. And 50 years later, suddenly it's reversed, and that to me, that kind of is unconvincing. Let's say, and I don't, in general, like the idea of changing rules. It seems to me that is geared entirely towards producing an outcome rather than saying, is this process fair? To the extent to which we should be involved in it, is it the most fair and prudent way to go forward? I don't. Right. It seems more like, hey, look, we can get more unions, and if we do it this way, and I'm not sure that's a swell thing to do. And I don't think conservatives, and I will never speak for them, are hanging their hat on it. I think it's more that they are just understandably worried about what's coming down the pike, and especially since many of them are complicit in a lot of the economic things that keep me up at night, and the kind of big government conservative response to everything over the last 8 years, that they're trying to dwell on something that in which Obama is actually different. I mean, I think I've said this last time, but it's certainly from the point of view of our magazine, the world didn't change on November 3rd or 4th, whatever it was for us. The world changed on September 24th. It was when, the big event of the fall was the bailout and the kind of freak out associated with it, because that stuff's going to be with us for years, and it's not by any stretch of the imagination some kind of democratic plot, as you were alluding to earlier. It's actually something like the opposite. There was a nicely bipartisan idea, and Republicans, have been taking the lead on what I think is both a sort of bizarre and ahistorical kind of approach to things. And so I think a lot of people who are lashed to that one way or the other are looking for something that has a uniquely democratic flavor to object to. Speaking of democratic flavors,
well, that's an interesting approach. I would just say just one. I mean, two things to add to that. One, I think what the unions have not, what those who favor card check have not conveyed. I don't think they've made a great case for it. I don't think they've conveyed adequately the level of intimidation that occurs now in those organizing campaigns. The other thing is, it's quite interesting that, I mean, we're looking at, I think, one of the last posts in the administration to be filled being the labor secretary, and there's a lot of, I mean, Obama's managed to split the difference on a lot of issues, like on education. There's the two great camps of education, the testing and standards camp, and the anti-testing. There are different ways of describing them. In Obama found a Secretary of Education who can kind of balance between those two camps. There's different approaches to how you do labor issues, and that's one where it's been harder for him to find the balance, and that has a lot to do with the uncertainty about whether that legislation will be able to move or not.
Do you have a quick handicap? Are there a couple of strong candidates, and we could maybe take some indication of direction if he chooses one over the other?
Well, I mean, I in a way, it's a little bit of a question of strategy. I mean, this is a moment, I think, where the labor movement feels like we want something that actually helps. We've been an essential part of the progressive, the progressive movement and the development of this progressive infrastructure and electing Democrats and moving things forward, for a long time, both in bad times and good for progressives. It's time for us to get something of our own. So they would want a labor secretary who kind of comes more directly out of their midst. Obviously, former Congressman David Bonnier from Michigan has been kind of one of their own. He's the chair of the organization that's really most directly involved in pushing for EFCA and related things. He's been kind of at one point he said he wasn't interested in the job, and then maybe he is a little bit. So it'd be something like that. I mean, the other alternative is look for somebody who's more of a progressive business person who has the capacity to reach out to some of the kinds of businesses that to some sector of the business community and say, look, this isn't going to be the end of the world, and here's the ways we can make it. Who could broker the compromise when it's time to broker the compromise, as opposed to Bonnier or somebody like that who would really be pushing for the full barrel. So it's all those strategic choices are really intertwined and are surprisingly complex for really such a straightforward piece of legislation.
We're running close to the end here. I wanted to get a more sort of personal reflection from you, if you would have. Your team, broadly speaking, just won. I am confident that you're of an age, and by which I mean probably close to mine, where and people in Washington. At some point, you must be having some friends who are either joining the administration or feeling sort of swept up in the moment. Can you describe kind of the sort of feeling, the atmosphere, and the circles in which you walk and communicate in? I mean, having any kind of relationship with power to me is as alien as possible. So I'm just kind of curious what it's like.
Well, I think I don't think I have too many close friends who are say going into the administration. I know a few people fairly well who are. It's interesting to me. I mean, I was in Washington at the beginning of the Clinton administration, and it's really interesting to me to contrast the two periods. And I was working on the Hill, and I was not a Clintonite, and I remember feeling at the time, I was connected enough that I was also young enough that it would have been fabulous to have some kind of job in the administration, it was very clear to me I didn't want to do it, and I was really, really. I remember being sort of from a distance, kind of worried about the triumphalism and the kind of the sense that there were no barriers, that we were just going to go charge through, and then of course you slam right into the enormous political barriers at the time. right now it seems like there's much more of a. I don't get that same sense of triumphalism. Partly because the actual problems are so enormous. So there's a kind of maturity and groundedness that people have, but also a sense. I mean, I keep looking at these cabinet choices, and some people think there aren't enough. People have their gripes about various things. To me, it just sort of seems like from each kind of category you could pick people, whether it's the former Clintonites or members of Congress or Gore, the circle around Gore, people like that. From each segment, they've picked people who they're extremely, extremely competent, and that really comes through. So there's a kind of it's kind of like the November 4th craze wore off very quickly and eased into this kind of methodical, competent, figure out the challenges, approach them one by one. So that, nobody's just running around thrilled by how we're gonna remake the world and push through these things. It's huge challenges and an intense awareness that you can do them wrong. And even though the Clinton experience was 16 years ago, I think it's a lot of those lessons are deeply embedded in people. So no, it's not like and it's sort of too weird to be true to have a president who's smart and competent and fundamentally shares progressive values. I mean, that's not something that any of us thought we'd see anytime soon. So,
I was not around Washington at all in 1992, and not really in the country for a long time.
Yeah,
but I do recall people telling me that you just couldn't imagine what it was like to be in and around Washington in '92. There's a real feeling like of restoration's the wrong word.
Right.
It's like it was very sort of like anything was possible. The revolution was in the air and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it had been 12 years in the wilderness, and a lot of people.
But it was wrong. It was wrong. You knew
it turned out to be wrong. I mean, he didn't have a huge mandate to begin with. The vote was divided up, and it is interesting. I mean, I think that there is a this is totally anecdotal, but more of a sense of sobriety this time around, when in fact there's much more reasons for celebration. As you mentioned, I mean, this is the first Democratic president since Jimmy Carter, and arguably, since before that, who progressives were genuinely excited about and didn't feel like was an artifact of a negotiation with some kind of triangulatory Democratic leadership council, right? He was an actual fire-breathing liberal, one of us, one. And so maybe people are trying not to jinx it or something, but I don't hear the same kind of celebrations kicking off. But then again, January, what is it, 20th? Are you going to stay in town? Have you rented out your place?
I think I will stay in town. I think this whole renting things out for many thousands of dollars thing, I'm not sure that's really quite panning out the way people thought it would for a while.
The market is flattening.
Yeah, well, markets don't work. You know that.
Yeah, I know. You're right at a price, and my price turned out to be zero.
I think it's all been a little exaggerated. I mean, I don't think 4 million people are going to come to Washington, and people, Washington brings in a lot of people in and out all the time. So I think it's all been a little bit over dramatized. But I think we're probably too far. We're in D.C., but we're pretty far up there on the red line to probably get the big bucks for our house.
Yeah.
Plus, we have nowhere else to go, so I think we'll hang around.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we should wrap up here. I think
okay, Matt.
The 1 hour mark. This has been great as
always,
and have happy holidays and whatnot.
One last word: please subscribe to the American Prospect and tell all your friends, and I'll make my friends subscribe to Reason.
And then subscribe to Reason. Yes, we will subscribe here presently. Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Matt.